This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts. Welcome to Body Count, a history podcast.
Jingle balls, jingle all the way. All right, you stocking stuffers. Today's support for Body Count Big Heads Media comes from Manscaped.com, the best in men's below-the-belt grooming. You heard me right, Manscaped. Precision tools for your family jewels. Oh, what fun it is to ride a precision Manscaped sleigh. Gentlemen, take it from me. When you're relaxing, maybe hitting the eggnog this Christmas season, that special someone doesn't want to look for your gift under an untrimmed tree. Unruly holly bushes are a thing of the past. Look no further than Manscaped's Lawnmower 2.0 with proprietary advanced skin-safe technology. This trimmer won't nick or snag your chestnuts. Nothing makes under the mistletoe more awkward than using your face trimmer downtown. Don't forget to grab Manscaped's Crop Preserver, an anti-chafing, moisturizing deodorant for your chestnuts. Means cozying up near the open fire with complete confidence. You'll be ready to sit in any lap this season. Give yourself, your friends, your family, or that special someone in your life the perfect package this holiday season. Get 20% off and free shipping with the code BIGHEADS, that's all caps, BIGHEADS at manscaped.com. Ladies, 'tis the season to stop hinting heat, trim the tree, and get proactive. Treat both of you with a gift that keeps on giving the whole year round at manscaped.com. Give the perfect package this holiday season with our special code BIGHEADS for 20% off with free shipping at manscaped.com. Now, to the show. Welcome back to Body Count. Bethany's laughing at my countdown as per usual because she is a real see you next Tuesday. So we're going to do something a little different today, guys, because I just absolutely need a break from Russian history, or I'm going to hang myself from the rafters of my outdoor Virginia barn.
At least it would be fitting for all the Romanov talk we've talked about. So swing it from the rafters.
You know what?
You'd fit right in Russia.
We were excited that we got to beheadings and not impalings or whatever else we're in. So we're going to break it up. We're going to break it up this week, and we're going to give you a little something special. We're going to talk about something a little different because none of us want to be in. Currently, I believe we just left 17th century Russia, and God help us, we got a long way to go. So we're going to take a little break. We're going to talk about Winston Churchill today, and we have a guest, guys, and we're so excited because for once you're not going to listen to me.
Somebody smarter than you.
Much smarter than me.
I wouldn't go that far. I can barely read it right.
That's so kind of you to say. Because I managed to grasp the very basic points of your book. So good for me. It's like you're speaking to a monkey. But welcome to our podcast. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Shoot.
Tell us who you are.
Hold on.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me, Bethany and Jessica. My name is Warren Dockter, or Dockter, which is ludicrously my name. I'm like a character on a Joseph Heller novel. I'm currently.
I was wondering, Doctor. I love it.
I'll give you
You're the Professor X of Churchill, man. That's like such a Marvel name.
I'm definitely the Doctor of Churchill.
I love it.
Oh, so. Tell us a little bit, now that we have your name, tell us a little bit about, one, who you are, what you do, and then why we're all here. We're going to plug your book.
Great. Okay. Well, so let me tell you who I am and how I got there. I'm from East Tennessee, and to make a long story short, came over to Britain to do my PhD at the University of Nottingham. And then I got a research fellowship at Cambridge. I was there for 4 years. And then I started at Aberystwyth University, which is where I'm at now, teaching international politics. So the books that I wrote.
Was that all?
Yeah, well, I can also say that I was the research assistant for the current Prime Minister Boris Johnson on his book, The Churchill Factor. That is absolutely true.
Sweet Lord.
I'm what Ron Burgundy would call a pretty big deal.
You kind of are. So that aside, one, I am glad that you have deigned to speak to two ass clowns like ourselves.
Like you said, you called yourself a monkey. Like, what the hell am I then? The turd from the monkey? Like, shit.
Radiation canary.
Hey, I'll take it. I'll take it. Okay. Jesus.
That's good.
Warren's here. Meanwhile, you and I are like licking the radium paintbrushes and watch factories in the early 20th century. That's just
it tastes good. Damn it.
That's the more kind of academic I am. I'm not a usual kind of academic. I'm also I like the lead paint.
Says the person that went to Cambridge. Okay, Cambridge people don't lick lead paint. Okay.
Well, you'd be surprised.
Yeah. I was about to say the same thing. Well, that's arguable.
Like you're just saying it to make us feel better.
No, I'm not. Genuinely, I've met some crazy people at Cambridge. We could do a whole podcast on that.
Ooh, I'm gonna write that down.
Yeah, that's going to be Bethany's next thing. Crazy academics.
Yeah, because I've seen through the veil of that, and there's some crazy shit out there.
I believe it. I mean,
hello, I'm best friends with a crazy academic, so I'm totally down.
That's true.
You know, with the binge drinking problem and chronic anxiety. I never leave my house unless it's to see something historical, and that's about it. I'm the worst person ever, though. I drag my family to a local agricultural museum for Southampton, Virginia, and because I was interested in the whole, Nat Turner element of where we live, and so I'm dragging my poor family around to see these homes in which the rebellion ended and whatever, and they're like, oh my God, I don't care, can we just go to the beach? And I'm like, sure. Idiots.
I like you got your family on like the Bataan death march of historical knowledge, and they're like, we want to go to
the
Oh, this is going to go so well because I've just gut laughed my way through the intro. That's fantastic. So, Warren, I'm not going to call you Doctor. I'm very much.
Oh, darn it!
I'm very much tempted to do so because, again, we are ass clowns. But why don't you? Because ultimately, what we're here to talk about is your book. So tell us the title of your book and where we can find it and purchase it.
It's available on Amazon. It's Churchill in the Islamic World, and it's in hardback and paperback now. The paperback just came out, which I'm very excited about.
Oh, good.
And the book is about Winston Churchill, how he shaped our sort of modern understanding of the Middle East and Britain's relationship with what I call broadly the Islamic world, and his sort of continuing role in doing that kind of through the first part of the 20th century, and it sort of just charts.
So it's basically about like how he paved the way to where we're at now.
Yeah, that's right, or at least had a major hand in paving the way to where we're at now.
Yeah,
I think so.
And I think that's so fascinating because a lot of times what we focus on, I feel like in Churchill, is going to be his involvement in the war years and maybe discussing, all of his political switches before and maybe the decline of, because unfortunately the Crown came out. And so Now people have an even greater misconception of who Churchill is.
And I'm one of those
that
people.
Show.
Because that's what I
that
know.
Show.
Poor John Lithgow.
Poor John Lithgow. Exactly right.
So, I mean, it's just weird because, I mean, to talk about Winston Churchill, you know, I completely agree with you. When you mention Winston Churchill, people automatically think Second World War. Most people don't even know that he even had a second government or a second ministry, second administration from 51 to 55. And they sure don't know that he entered politics in 1900 when Victoria was still on the throne. So, you know, he sat from 1900 to 1960 in Parliament.
See, when you say
no, go ahead, Bethany.
I was just going to say, when somebody says Winston Churchill, my immediate thought goes, hey, I know that guy from somewhere. I feel like I've heard that name before.
He's that guy with the...
He's that one guy that did something back in the day. I know it was important, but I don't remember what.
Gary Oldman plays him in that movie.
See? There you go.
Oh my God, I'm crying. It's amazing. God, see, Bethany, this is why you needed to be on this. I knew it would be amazing. Because people think Gary Oldman. Before we get into anything, go ahead, Warren, give us the most basic Encyclopedia Brown definition of just who is Sir Winston Churchill.
So, Winston Churchill, right, is a famous prime minister from the Second World War. But before that, he was a young man. He was a soldier, right? He grew up in the sort of British military. He served in various campaigns for the British, you know, on the northwest frontier in India, and then in Egypt and Sudan, and also the Boer War in South Africa. He then entered politics as a very young man in 1900, and then famously switched sides in 1904 from the Conservatives to the Liberals. And a lot of people don't know that Churchill in 1909 helped bring about things like the tea break, or you know, sort of pensions and social health care. Really laid the groundwork for what would later become the NHS under Clement Attlee after the Second World War. Then, of course, in the First World War, he was the First Lord of the Admiralty. After the mistake of the Dardanelles, he was dismissed, went and fought on the front himself, then came back as sort of Minister for War, the Minister for the Colonies, Minister for Air, then was Chancellor of the Exchequer through the 1920s. And then he went through what he called the wilderness years, where he didn't hold a cabinet position, but he was still in the Parliament and spent a lot of time in his country house. And then you get to the Second World War. And he died in 1965. So there's a whole host of stuff after the Second World War, you know, where he's in opposition and then comes back and has his own government just before the Suez Crisis in 1956. So, I mean, he's a hugely important person for shaping. I mean, when people think of Great Britain, invariably they think about Winston Churchill, in part because of his amazing wit, right?
He's just a full-around badass.
He was.
What's the thing he says about switching back and forth on parties? What was that quote? And I cannot think of it right now. Something about rapping something, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. Absolutely cracks me up.
When he re-entered the Conservatives in 1924, I think it was. You know, a lot of Conservatives were very upset with him, and he was at the sort of Conservative Party conference, and he said, you know, anybody can rat, but it takes genius and ingenuity to re-rat.
Yes, I love Churchill. I love Churchill so much, and I am so glad that I have almost bitten my tongue in half, because I know that we want to get to a very specific subject today. But while you were going through all of that, there are just so many things that I want to get into. And as you're saying them and as you're going through it, I'm just going, so let's break this down. Why don't we back up to this? But we do want to get to a very specific subject. And that was just the most amazing, succinct rundown of Encyclopedia Britannica that I've ever heard. It was amazing. Now that we've kind of established that baseline, I do want to say what we're essentially going to be looking at today, because we talked about all those things and we talked about Churchill a little bit, is we're very much going to be kind of looking through a window of Islam and the British Empire through the life of Churchill today. And that is what I think is so brilliant about your book. But now that we established that baseline a little bit, tell us about what Islam, because I don't think that a lot of people necessarily associate Islam with the British Empire. That's not your first thought.
No.
What does no?
No, it's not. You told me the title of this book, and I was like, I'm confused. What does Islamic have to do with this?
Well, it's real interesting, right? And so there are 2 points here I want to make. One, you don't think of the British Empire and Islam, and two, you certainly don't think of Churchill and Islam. Or if you do, it's bad. So in the first instance, what people don't understand in the 19th century, when Britain was still holding India, that in global power terms, the British Empire was a Muslim empire. If you think of all the population, all the Muslims in India and elsewhere inside the British Empire, once you include Egypt and Sudan and so forth, which Britain sort of informally controlled, and Persia, the British Empire sort of had more Muslims than the Ottoman Empire, which is, of course, the sort of caliphate, right, in Islam.
That is so crazy to think.
Recognize that word. You said Ottoman. I know that word. I learned about that word.
Like the thing you can put your feet up on.
No. I've been learning about it in Russian history. And
exactly.
I've heard it I know that word.
Oh my God, you too. I'm just
the Russians and the Ottomans were arch nemesis for a long time.
Yes, I know that.
And that's good, because what happens is, for people like Churchill's father and other conservatives, they see the Ottoman Empire as an ally against the real enemy of the British Empire, which was the Russian Empire. So they see the Ottoman Empire as an ally most of the time. And also because the British Empire has this sort of Islamic character in the same way the Ottoman Empire does. So a lot of conservatives see that there's a sort of synergy, I guess, that would go on between them. Now, the other point that I think I'd like to make is about Churchill and Islam, because if you go right now and you Google Churchill and Islam, you're going to get a very specific quote that's taken out of context that sort of says how much Churchill hates Muslims.
Oh.
And if you look at this particular quote and you put it in its context, I talk about this in the intro of my book, it's very clear that he's talking about a very specific type of Islam that was practiced by dervish Muslims in the Sudan. And in fact, Churchill, had much more sympathy than people would have originally thought with the kind of Islamic world, and even kind of had this romantic kind of Victorian fascination with Islam. I mean, if you look at a lot of the paintings he painted later in life, they're of sort of Islamic bazaars and Islamic mosques in Morocco, where he would go frequently. So he has a sort of interest in it, and this shouldn't surprise us. This is a guy, right, that served as a young man on the northwest frontier in what is present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, and then serves in Egypt and Sudan. So, he is sort of connected in that way.
Because he spent all that time there.
Yeah, exactly. And this later goes on to influence his policies, right, when he's colonial secretary in 1921, when Britain more or less makes the modern map of the Middle East that we know today. So this heavily, he brings a lot of influence from his own experiences there and other people that you don't necessarily associate Churchill with that are experts in that field. People like T. Lawrence and a guy named Wilfred Blunt and others who Churchill really valued their opinions of. And it helped him sort of shape the Middle East that we know today. And of course, we'll
Blunt
get into this.
He was very kind of romanticized, I guess I would say, probably in a way. Like life in the Islamic Empire and also very anti-colonialist, was he not, or am I taking that too far?
Well, I wouldn't say
anti-imperialist, maybe.
Well, Wilfrid Blunt was certainly anti-imperialist.
Yes.
Churchill was not. Churchill was obviously kind of an arch.
Well, yeah.
But the fact that he listens to people like Wilfrid Blunt who are radicals, right?
Right.
Because he values their opinion on the Middle East is really remarkable. And this is something I think that's remarkable about Winston Churchill as a leader and about him as a character, is that he surrounds himself with people, even if he doesn't agree with their views, and listens to what his experts have to say. Right, which is a remarkable trait.
No, I agree, and that is what I love about him so much, because you're exactly right. Is because and we'll get into, and we'll go ahead, because I don't think we established either how staunchly Victorian Churchill was,
right? Yeah.
And I mean, ultimately,
like the OG.
Even though he switched. Well, yeah,
he's like the OG of like all of this, like.
Just like the OG, exactly like the OG.
I mean, yeah. And so I think that's so interesting that he takes such a radical view, and not only that, but not an advisor, but calls this guy a friend and listens to what he has to say. And maybe, and I don't know, we'll probably get into this as we start to dive into this. Yes, I would say he used some of this stuff, maybe even, and would you agree, Warren, to turn it to his political advantage. But it doesn't mean that it negates what he was able to achieve and what his ultimate views were.
And that's
he was a
people
politician.
Liked him so much because of the fact that he was like, all right, look, I'm going to listen to you. I may not like it, but I'm going to take it into consideration and go from there. Because he wasn't just being like, no, you're wrong. You know, so.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, this is one of the things, if you could light his imagination a little bit, he'd listen to you no matter what your views were. You know what I mean?
If somebody came in pantomiming how to cut heeds off, like, hello, I'm creative. I'm not going to go for it, but I'm watching.
I'm still like, you have my attention.
I'm not going to do it, but cool. Okay.
And I think that's why that's so amazing. Tell us a little bit about his background, though. And because I'm going off on why I think that's amazing, but then again, I know kind of the background he came from. And it's like you said, when you were giving us a definition, he starts from very Victorian all the way to the 1960s and all the life and the changes that he saw. So tell us a little bit about maybe Churchill's background and what he initially took as his views before he entered any kind of service in the Islamic world.
I think that this is a really big point about the making of Winston Churchill. So what people often forget, because it's real easy to think of him in the 30s or even in the Second World War as a sort of old man who's very Victorian. He's born in 1874, right? And so his education, by the time you get to 1940, he's lived a lifetime and in British politics. But if we go back before all of that stuff, he comes up in the sort of very traditional British education system. He's educated at Harrow. And, in Harrow, they specialize in what's called an imperial education because the men that would go out and run the empire would be educated at Harrow and Eton and places like that. Real sort of, it's where you'd send your upper class. Even today, there's a real distinction about people who go to Harrow and Eton.
I was going to say, when did Eton come into? Okay, never mind. I'm not going to sidetrack.
I don't know,
but
right. It's way back in the day. Eton is, this is maybe like 1200. I don't know
when that became, it's just interesting to me that became the places but not important. He was educated there. Let's go on.
Yeah, exactly. So he's educated there. And he tells us there. I mean, there's interesting stuff. He has to learn Latin and learn about sort of history and politics. He's not a great student.
I feel his pain.
He takes up a commission to go to India, right? As an officer, he's educated at Sandhurst the same year that his father dies, 1895, and he takes up a commission to go to the Queen's Own Hussars, that's what they're called, in India. And he goes out there, and when he gets there, right, he's hanging out in Bombay and other places because he's not yet gone to the front. And he starts spending a lot of his time reading, like reading voraciously to pass the time because there's not a lot else to do.
Right.
And so he sort of educates himself and decides
that's better than going out and doing drugs and whoring. So, yay.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what I did. But
that's what we all did.
No, he sat under a tree and read, and he read a lot, like a boatload. And there are all these requests you can see in the archives of him writing back to his family, requesting stuff. We also have to remember, he grew up in Blenheim Palace, right? I mean, he comes from a very aristocratic background, and that kind of sets him apart as well. So he kind of has the ability to write back to his family and say, "Oh, please send out these books and this kind of stuff." And
can
so
his
while
family read? I mean, I'm just curious.
Could they read?
He can write. I mean, he could write, but could they read his notes? I'm just curious.
Yes-ish.
Yeah.
His handwriting actually is not so bad once you get used to reading it. If you've ever trolled through the archives of sort of other 19th century people, there's a guy named Nathaniel Curzon, and his handwriting is just loops. It's just like somebody sat down and drew loops, spirals, and that's his handwriting.
I'd be able to read that. I can read that. I write like that.
I love the hashtag Twitter Storians, though, when people put that out and they're like, can anybody take a guess what this might be? I can figure out da-da-da-da-da, but what is this right here? So, yeah, no, that's interesting. But let's get back to, so he's reading, he's writing, he's not filling his time, I would say, even as young men of the time, especially of his background, might necessarily fill their time when they've got all this spare time in a foreign land on their hands.
That's right. I mean, one of the things he does take up that it becomes a lifelong passion is polo. And he starts playing polo with Muslim guys in India. And they're sort of on the same side. And he writes later about sports and how it's important that, because up to that time, natives, as they were called, couldn't win the Victoria Cross. Mm-hmm. And he writes a thing saying, well, they ought to be able to win the Victoria Cross because, they can play polo. It's very, very sort of imperial framed, if you know what I mean. And, and the other thing to say about him coming up, and I should have said this before, is he inherits a lot of his worldviews from his father. And these are very conservative Tory views about how the Ottoman Empire is an ally, like I was explaining, and the Russians are who you're really afraid of. And he gets this sort of, and also that, of course, that the British Empire is pushing civilization as far as it can. So when Churchill originally arrives in India, he doesn't give a shit about the natives. He doesn't want to learn the language. He doesn't, he's not interested. And you can see his early letters. He's like, I'm not even going to be here that long. This is silly. This is uncivilized, blah, 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 blah. But when he goes to the Northwest frontier and he has to fight alongside these, a lot of people in his unit were Muslims, or I say unit, but the people that he was stationed with. And of course, they were fighting these sort of fanatical Muslims, not too different or dissimilar to what goes on today in Afghanistan. He develops a sort of real interesting kind of respect for these guys, a kind of battlefield respect. Because they're difficult, I guess, to fight against. And this comes out in his writing, and he compares this sort of, Britain and his own men to sort of these guys, and that if Britain was attacked, would they fight with the sort of ferociousness that these guys
passion,
exactly. And so this really sets him apart, I think, from other writers of the time that are just saying, look at these crazy people,
He has a "we this band of brothers" type moment, I guess.
Yeah. That's right. And that book is called The Malacan Field Force. That was his first book that he ever wrote, because he becomes a very famous journalist.
I was going to say, drop to people that he does become a famous journalist, and I don't think a lot of people know that. And he writes books long before his political career really kicks off.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, he was one of Britain's, if not the highest paid, one of the highest paid journalists after the Boer War, so around 1900, 1901.
That's amazing. This guy's life. I mean.
Well, it's because he's absolutely nuts. I mean, he keeps volunteering for missions you don't come back from.
But he does.
But he does. I mean, that's what's remarkable. So he keeps trying to make a big name for himself. And
that's why I called him the OG, man. Like,
no, I'm with you.
Like he went out to pure fuckery and came back a badass. Like, hello.
That's right. So the thing that really makes his career is when he goes in the Boer War, he's captured, right?
Oh shit!
And becomes a POW and then escapes. And
like the badass he is, damn, he's cool as shit.
Like the badass he is, comes back and then writes a book about it, and then that's the thing. It makes him an absolute, becomes a household name. In sort of how old have you been? I don't know, in his 20s.
Yeah.
Because he escaped that. But before he did that, if I back up, so the next time he goes out, and he wrote a brilliant book called The River War about his time in Egypt and Sudan.
Yes.
And this means we got to go back in time a little bit. So how we get here, how the British Empire gets here, is in 1882. There was a riot, and a guy named Urabi Pasha was going to try to overthrow the kind of existing, Khedive, it would be called, the person who's in charge of Egypt. And basically Britain's like, no, because Britain has just invested in the Suez Canal, wants to protect its investments, doesn't want anything to nationalize. So they put it down and basically assume control of Egypt, right? And the Sudan. Mm-hmm. Well, shortly after that, a place down in Sudan called Khartoum is being besieged by a man called the Mahdi, whose name was Muhammad Ahmed, and he was a kind of a dervish warlord who thought that he was the second coming of Christ in Islamic terms. It literally, Mahdi is a bit like Messiah in sort of Islamic. It's not the same, but it's kind of the redeemer of Islam. Mm-hmm. And so Gladstone sends some people down to go deal with the Mahdi. A guy named General Gordon, who's a famous Victorian hero, this guy. And he gets down there and he sort of helps out Khartoum, and he's getting besieged and he gets trapped there. And, basically Gladstone told this guy, okay, you go down there, you sort this out, and then you get out. But Charles Gordon, because he's crazy, decides, no, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to see it through to the end and we'll fight the Mahdi off. Well, that doesn't happen. And Gordon gets killed. And so that's the moment at which the Mahdi assumes control of Sudan and stays in control of Sudan until about 1898. And it's a guy named Horatio Kitchener. And you'll recognize him because he's on all the sort of British posters with the big handlebar mustache pointing at you.
Yes.
First World War. He takes a division and creates a sort of slow march down to Khartoum to take it back and to destroy the Mahdi's forces, although the Mahdi dies in the meantime. Churchill's a part of that, and Churchill writes a fantastic history of that war called the River War. And when he published this book, this is where that quote I'm talking about, that if you Google Churchill, it comes up. But what's really interesting is that the original version of that history that Churchill writes is 2 volumes, and it only ran for 1 year. And then they sort of turned it into 1 volume and cut out loads and loads of material. And they did this because Churchill, he says some things about Kitchener that nobody likes. And Kitchener's a national hero. And Churchill's like, look, this guy fought real down and dirty. He's not a good guy. And they have a real falling out. They don't become friends again for like 12 years later. Churchill really doesn't like him. Because he sort of fought dirty, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, actually. We'll get to that on the cover of your book. That's very picture.
Which book do you have, the hardback or the?
I have the hard.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, of course she's got the hard one.
Go. Fuck yourself. I'm sorry.
Hey,
Lauren,
you're the one that likes to jizz all over history, so of course you get the hardback, okay?
I do. It's
There's nothing wrong with that.
Fantastic photograph. It's a fantastic photograph.
It is a great photograph. I'm always happy to do a history facial.
Yes. Yes, for it.
Yes.
Oh, I sell it for the camera girls.
Just not the hair.
Right.
Just not the hair, okay?
Hey, whatever it takes, sister.
Oh, you go all the way. Okay.
Yeah, I'm crying. And
Just don't turn it back now.
No, I think because getting back to that, sorry, we get sidetracked and we have to laugh sometimes because we are children and ass clowns and our listeners know this. But getting back to what I think is so interesting, and we're going to get back to the River War because I want to talk about it some more because I think it's where all of our misunderstanding of where you fill the gap kind of comes in. But also, I think it's interesting that maybe, and I don't know exactly how to put this, but I guess Orthodox Islam, is that what I'm saying, at the time felt the same way that,
yes,
the British Empire felt, correct?
That is correct. So the Ottoman Empire, right? Who would have been Sultan then is Abdul Hamid II.
Okay.
Is in charge of the Ottoman Empire and is the Khalifa of Islam. And you've got this guy running around in the Sudan calling himself the Mahdi. Well, that's sort of like David Koresh calling himself the Messiah. So,
God damn it, that was such a good comparison. Okay, sorry, go on.
So obviously the Ulma, which is a sort of group around the sort of learned men of Islam around the Sultan, are all condemning this movement because they're like, this guy's nuts. He's just some kind of wacko out there saying that he's the Mahdi of Allah. Well, that's nonsense. Of course he's not.
I'm the second coming of Christ. Listen to me.
Well,
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So obviously the sort of Orthodox.
In this case, Bethany.
Well, you know what I fucking meant, okay? Gah.
Okay. Fine.
So both the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, who's also still sort of technically in charge of Egypt, sort of, kinda, and that's a whole other podcast. Is like, whatever you guys take him out, that's fine. Whatever, anything to shut that guy up. So the British Empire is like, hey, we see a way we can extend our influence in Africa. We go down the Nile. We're doing this whole imperialism, colonialism thing. So it sort of made sense for them to do that. So Churchill's a part of this movement, and he sees one of the last full cavalry charges of the British Army against the Dervish at Omdurman, which is just sort of across the river from Khartoum. While he's there, and apparently by, I think, his account, he kills, I think, 4 Dervish warriors in this sort of famous cavalry charge.
Yeah.
Pew, 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 pew.
Exactly. There's a lot of that. And what's really interesting is Kitchener doesn't like Churchill because Churchill, when he wrote the Malacan Field Force, is pissing people off, saying that the British Army is being run by idiots and nobody listens to him, and he's that kind of stuff.
I'm smart and you're dumb.
Exactly.
Listen to me. Sorry.
It was the case, though.
I don't want. Yeah, it was the case. I don't want this guy to come on my expedition. Well, Churchill winds up on the expedition anyway,
of course,
and basically without Kitchener knowing it. And Kitchener only finds out after the fact, which sort of infuriated him. So this is why in the first edition of the River War, he also says some choice things about Kitchener, but because Kitchener's stock is so high, he removes them. The bad stuff he says about Kitchener, but this is also where that passage about Muslims is also taken out. And again, if you look at the full passage, it's clear he's talking about Dervish Muslims because he says, hundreds have become loyal subjects of the Queen. Well, of course, he's not talking about actual Islam in the British Empire, because millions had become loyal subjects of the Queen. You see what I mean? So, it's very clear that he's talking about a very specific fanatical sect of Islam, not Islam in general. Now, the reason this gets taken out of context is during the Second Iraq War. Winston Churchill III was a friend with a lot of neoconservative cats in the Bush administration. And he digs up this quote so they can vanish about and use it for political purposes. But he's the one that edits out those bits that make it clear he's talking about the dervish.
Right, that he is talking about a radicalized sect of Islam that Orthodox Islam no more accepts than what the British Empire did. That this is just a bunch of crazies running around in the desert. It has nothing to do with Islam itself.
Yeah, exactly. And then this is, so his sort of, people are always a bit like, whoa, Churchill's actually sympathetic with Islam. And, there was a story here a while back. And I mean, it was interesting because the story said that I found the letter, and I didn't really. The letter was actually published by Martin Gilbert. I was first to say, guys, this is important because Churchill's sister-in-law in 1907 thought that he was going to convert to Islam.
Oh, the Bertie, what was her name?
Yes, that's right, Gertie, Gwendolyn.
There you go.
And she writes in this letter saying, I have noticed quote-unquote Pasha-like tendencies in you. I really have. And is concerned that he's going to convert to Islam. And, I'm sure that part of it's a joke, but also she's clearly quite concerned because he's spending a lot of his time by 1907 with Wilfrid Blunt, who's himself this kind of radical Arabist. And he goes on a tour of Africa back to the places that he was at, during the River War and stuff when he was under a colonial secretary. So,
and I very much, because I wanted to ask you about that, and I really wanted to get into that because when I look at that, I think that, I mean, yes, she's joking. Nobody thought that Winston Churchill was actually going to convert to Islam. And because I see a lot of misrepresentation of that from the far left and from the far right of, he was going to convert to, no, she's clearly kidding. But I also think that's really interesting because it speaks to his very conservative, very Victorian roots in that even the fact that he's looking at things from a much broader perspective was kind of out of the grasp almost of the people that knew him and the way that he'd grown up and what a different thinker he really was.
He's open-minded. And even though he wasn't going to convert, he was like willing to actually learn and get more in depth so he could understand the differences and go from there, which is smart.
I completely agree. I mean, when I did the BBC World Service about this, people were like, do you think he was going to convert to Islam? And I was like, look, no. No, of course not.
Don't take what I say out of context, okay? All right? This isn't Winston Churchill here.
That's the headline everybody wants. But
exactly.
That's not it at all. What this letter doesn't tell us anything about Winston Churchill, and in fact tells us about her and the society he came from. Just because he's going out and listening to people doesn't mean he's going to be a Muslim. And again, it's all, it's clear that she's kidding, but there's truth in jokes, right? So,
right.
So I completely agree with you. And I mean, there are moments again when you can see. So in 1921, when he's colonial secretary, Lloyd George is like, look, and we'll come to this in a second, but the Middle East is screwed up. You need to solve this problem. Right. And he has the presence of mind to say, exactly, fix it. Somebody do something with this. He has at least, he doesn't understand the difference between Shia and Sunni, but he has the presence of mind to ask. And I think that's really remarkable in 1921 because how many people in the Bush administration asked?
Oh, well, I was going to say, how many people asked today?
They just assumed.
And there may have been, to me, some failures of maybe tribal lines. And of course there are failures. But in 1921, I agree. The fact that he was willing to try to ask and understand in and of itself tells you maybe what that gap is that I feel like a lot of neoconservatives hijack Churchill when it comes to Islam, when the fact is he's obviously as open-minded as somebody in 1921 is going to be.
And he didn't just ask, he asked the right questions.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He didn't just be like, what's your favorite color, Islam? No. You know what I mean? Or, you know, oh, it's that? Well, we're a different color. So, no, it's like he actually did the right thing and was like, hey, I'm genuinely interested to see why you believe this and where you got from, so I can then be like, all right, cool, I don't agree, but hey, let me
go ahead and stop us anytime that we're misconstruing anything that you're saying, Warren.
Mainly me.
Sorry, my phone dropped out there. Sorry.
No.
I lost my.
It happens.
Okay, cool. So I didn't even hear what we said. Awesome. I'm totally okay with that.
What's the last thing you heard?
I don't remember.
Yay! I like you, Warren.
Welcome to our podcast.
Assume you were saying that, yeah, exactly. I can only assume you were saying what an incredibly dashing and brilliant guest I am.
That is exactly what we said.
That is actually in my notes because we keep sidetracking you. So I'm trying to take a running total of where I can get you back on. You know, I've got Kitchener, I've got all of this. No, we were just discussing, and we're going to leave all of this in, by the way, because
so good.
We're gonna.
It's authentic.
This is our podcast, and we're authentic. But no, we were discussing the difference in Sunni and Shiite and 21, and we were talking about, yes, mistakes maybe in the drawing of maps were made, but the presence of mind that Churchill had, even in 1921, to ask those questions, maybe along tribal lines, along Islamic lines, and how that's very much been hijacked by neoconservatives.
Yes, I think that that's right, and I mean, you know, because it, you know, for a long time, people that sort of researched this were just like, well, he wanted out of this position, he didn't really want to do it, he hated doing it, and so they sort of gloss over it. But actually, it's his process as colonial secretary is much more involved than that. So let me back up to the First World War and take you through this, because this is an important turning point. So for years, Churchill, since 1911, really, tried to get the British Foreign Office to come to terms, some kind of an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. At various times against the Italians and against others. And he's trying to, you know, on the grounds, and you can see these letters he wrote to Lord Grey saying, you know, we're both Muslim powers, we need to be on the same side. Now, the First World War comes around, and for various reasons, Churchill, takes the ships back that he was going to give to the Ottoman Empire, because they, he requisitions ships that they had built for the Ottomans because he thought that they would need them, you know, against Germany. Right. And this, of course, is one of the things that people had said is why the Ottoman Empire sided against Britain, which is not true. No. There was a secret agreement that had already been signed because Enver Pasha was very pro-German, and that they were going to be a part of the Central Powers all along. But this is a major moment for Churchill, because he thinks, holy cow, you know, I've been trying to ally myself with these guys, and they're not going to play ball. And even you know, after the Dardanelles, he's writing letters home to his wife about how he and Enver Pasha are in the New World after the war, are going to build a sort of new order, right? Which is really remarkable. But as First Lord of the Admiralty, he has to try to figure out a way to sidestep the Western Front, because obviously that's just become a meat grinder, and then two, deal with the Ottoman problem. So he comes up with this idea that you could force the Ottoman Straits, send ships up the Dardanelles Straits, show up in Istanbul, and then Istanbul would eventually stop fighting, which sounds totally insane. However, Churchill had personal contacts with other members of the CUP, like Talat Bey Pasha and Jamal Bey Pasha, and he thought that if British ships showed up, there'd be enough to cause an internal coup. Right, that the sort of Anglo side of the CUP, which is the Committee of Union and Progress, that was in charge of the Ottoman Empire, would switch sides. Like that'd be enough, at least, to get them to become a neutral state.
How very Commodore Perry of him. Okay.
Indeed, yeah.
So, hey, I don't mean to interrupt, but isn't this around the same time, like around Edward VIII stuff that was happening? Or am I wrong?
Edward VIII. That's later.
Duke of Windsor. That's a little later, Bethany.
That's
We're a little before this.
Well, it just sounds a little familiar. That's why. It just feels like kind of feel a little familiar. Like I'm like, why does this feel like I've heard this story?
Because I took you all the way back to this.
Okay. Okay. All right.
So I always have to think the difference between Edward VIII and Edward VII.
Big old difference.
Turns out.
No, Bethany is probably most familiar with Churchill from our Edward VIII episode.
Yes.
And really quickly, because we did a big series on the 8th and the Bonn archives and the Windsor files and talking about going through the Ardennes. But Bethany...
That's why it feels familiar. I'm like, wait.
I'm going to stop you. Like we're going to get right back. We are going to get right back to where we were. But really quickly, I want to tell you this is why... Because now you know Churchill's background. This is why Churchill always, in the end, also kind of supported the Duke of Windsor, because he was very Victorian and very aristocratic. Okay.
Okay. It makes sense. Okay. All right, cool. I'm following. It just kind of threw me for a loop.
Like he's going to neutralize.
Wait.
He's going to neutralize any power that he had, but that's what you should know about, and why I kind of wanted to establish that Victorian background, why aristocracy is always going to matter.
Yeah, and it does to him, and he's a hardcore monarchist all the way, up into his death. He buys into the whole divinity of kings, all that.
The crown comes first.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, so obviously this plan to force the Dardanelles, that doesn't end too well for Churchill or Britain, because they attempt to do that. The commanders sort of get scared after they lose a couple ships. They fall back, and then they decide that Kitchener decides that it needs to be a land attack at Gallipoli. And in addition, and of course, this just becomes another meat. Yeah, exactly, another meat finder.
So don't make me pronounce that, okay?
No, it took a long time for me to get it right, and I'm not even sure I'm saying it right. So Churchill resigns his position as First Lord of the Admiralty, and then he gets a sort of silly position called the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, which is a do-nothing position, which he also resigned.
Lancaster.
Yeah, and he goes and he joins the front in the First World War,
which is kind of cool. Like, he didn't just talk the talk; he walked the walk.
No, that's exactly right, Warren. Like, he really was a badass. Like, he was. I just, there's nobody you can compare him to.
Think of any of our leaders today in Britain or the U.S., doesn't matter. And let's say that they acknowledge they got something wrong. Yeah, guys, I messed that one up. So to make amends, I'm going to go fight on the ground. I'm going to give up my
position. One ever.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's why. And ultimately, I think maybe this is why that gives him so much clout in the portion of his life that we talk about, like, because he did walk the walk and talk the talk. And I would even argue that, like you said, it's not even necessarily his fault, but on paper, he's going to be the fall guy.
He is, yeah, because Kitchener dies shortly after this, right? He's on a boat that gets torpedoed, and nobody's
he's on a boat.
That's a terrible.
He's on a boat, motherfucker. Take a look.
Don't you on a boat? But
that's one of the greatest songs ever written or recorded.
Oh, absolutely!
I'm so glad, Warren, you just started singing along with me. Thank you.
Usually, I throw virtual shit at her, and I'm like, "Shut up, bitch!" Like, I'm talking about history. I'm rapping about history here. Pay attention. But no, I think that is just absolutely fascinating to me. God, he's such an interesting guy, because you're exactly right. Who among any Western leaders today can we even compare him to?
I don't know. This is what's remarkable. And so he goes, and we know that he did, I think at least, and Gilbert did this in his biography, he while he was on the front at Plugstrada in Belgium, he took himself 33 missions into no man's land.
Jeez. Did he really? I did not know that.
Yeah.
33?
So it's not like he's just hanging out on the front.
You can do like one or two. It wasn't like, oh, hey, I've been there, done that. Okay, I can write about it.
But into no man's land, Bethany, like, we're not going to explain all that because we're going to have to sidetrack a long ways that I don't have patience or time for. I love you, but
I know. I get it.
Insane.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's nuts. It's
idea.
Nuts. And while he's there, by the way, he more or less, and he was still technically the Admiralty, but he's sending letters back because he invents the fucking tank.
What? Does he really?
Yeah. For real. So people had come up with the idea of an armored personnel carrier. And he, when he's at the First World of the Army, was like, put tracks on it. You know, it won't go through the mud. You got to put tracks on it. He literally, you know, it's not fair to say literally. It's not fair to say he literally invented the tank. But the sort of first iterations of the tank we know of, you know, because you could argue that Da Vinci invented the tank if you want to go back.
Well, yeah, if you really want to like argue, but if we're going to get down to, you know, we can argue the light bulb, we can argue, you know, electric. But exactly. I do agree. First iteration in which he was in a position in which people would pay attention to that idea being put forth. So I agree with you there. Like he did.
So he says, you know, put tracks on this stuff. He's sending back his thoughts and stuff to it back to the Admiralty office, who is then putting stuff to the Minister of War, which he comes back and then sort of becomes Minister of Munitions, basically because Lloyd George liked him so much he brought him back into the cabinet. He had no reason to do that whatsoever. Just brings him back in because he's a nice guy.
Yep.
And puts Churchill doing that. And so, you know, he really pursues this tank thing and boom, you get tanks. And that's because Churchill had the idea to, you know, make it real, you know, and dream of something nuts and then make it real. And that was Churchill's power, I think, was taking crazy ideas and realizing them, which in many ways is more important than... And
vocalizing them.
Yeah.
Which kind of relates back even to what we're talking about as far as taking in Islam and like we were talking about, he's almost like the Odin all-father of politics, like his curiosity knows no bounds. That's
true. That is true.
Which I think is so fascinating because he encourages, he's always been very staunch in his beliefs. And that, Bethany, that kind of goes back to why we were discussing Edward, but he also knew enough to take everything in. He would modernize, but he always held that very staunch conservatism and Victorianism. I shouldn't even say conservatism because there was such a political revolution in and of that time and what the definition of that was. I think it almost feels like there's
a healthy balance. It really does. It feels like there's like a healthy balance of everything. Like he's like, all right, I got this, and this, and I'm going to put it all together and be like, hey.
He has a lot of good stuff. I mean, he's got bad stuff as well. I mean, let's not, the idea to go down.
Yeah.
Don't we all?
Of course we do. But I mean, it's not, I don't want to paint it.
We don't want to glorify and like,
exactly.
and because, I feel like there's a lot of that is what you think of everything that is good about Britain and everything. But that's not the case. There were some bad things because, again, he was a staunch conservative.
That's correct.
So a lot comes bad with it. But I would argue that of all the ideas that come, and even if we're going to go back to the war because this is going to be important when we get into the rest of our narrative. But I would argue that he considered it, which was more than the majority, 98% of the government was willing to do.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So he, by the time he basically becomes colonial secretary after the close of the war. And there's a problem here. Lloyd George, the British government, have worked out that they've sold the same land 3 times. They've promised to France they're going to split up the
haunted or
no.
Oh.
Yes.
He said yes, you said no. So wait, which
by
is
the
it?
ghosts of imperialism past.
Okay.
It's haunted. It's haunted by the Abrahamic religions.
Okay.
And so you have a situation where Britain has told France, yeah, we're going to split the Ottoman Empire with you guys, and you'll get this area and we'll get the other area. It also told the Arabs that they would get their own state.
Oh.
Right, because they rebel against the Ottoman Empire with T.E. Lawrence. And they also tell the Jews, right?
This is your land.
Yeah, exactly. And that they'll establish a sort of Jewish national home in Palestine.
Man, that's like trying to cut the pie in too many slices.
And so Lloyd George is like, here, you sort this out. He gives it to Churchill. He's like, you got to figure out how to square this circle, which is what the Cairo Conference in 1921 is about. And, there's some interesting...
That's a podcast in and of itself, right?
It is. But... I mean, so we won't spend too much time dissecting that, because that is literally that takes up 2 chapters of my book. Because this is one of the...
I am astounded by your editor's ability to only keep it down to 2 chapters. Like, good for y'all.
Yeah, no.
Because as I'm reading it, I was going, this is so freaking succinct. I am never this succinct. Like, wow.
I appreciate you saying it was hard to do.
Oh God, but it was so succinct and it was so amazing, because when I got to that portion of the book, and I know some of you, like I know Paul, a lot of people out there are really going to go and read this. I was absolutely astounded at how succinct that you guys managed to make that. And again, how readable this is. That's why we're doing this for our podcast, because you're just starting at the beginning and going again. So I think it's absolutely fascinating. I'm sorry I interrupted you because I got excited. I got history excited.
I'm humbled. Thank you very much. And it's very easy to get history excited about this stuff. So what I'm going to do is run.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, I'm rubbing my temple, going, what the hell are they talking about?
Where's Cairo?
Where the hell is Cairo? What the fuck is the Suez Canal?
God damn it. I stopped taking notes a while back because I'm like, all right, hold on. They're going too fast for me.
Okay, well then Bethany, slow us down, because that's
because it's making sense though, because once I've stopped taking notes, I'm not like focusing on the actual sentence, like I'm actually engaging in the conversation, and I get it to an extent.
Okay.
Well, that's good though. That's a good place to start. So let me run through what happens at the Cairo conference.
Cool.
Churchill has to settle these things, and he comes up, of course, with the idea of putting Jordan in, right?
Right.
So from the outset, originally, Chaim Weizmann and the sort of Jewish people that were from the Balfour Declaration were promised a land, thought they were getting all of the Palestinian mandate. Churchill cuts the
That's
Palestinian
not going to
mandate in half.
cause problems.
Yeah, right. This is going to be fine. What?
This is going to be fine, Balfour.
Yeah.
It's like expecting to be like, it's like, look at this big box, and then you open it up and it's like this tiny little piece of grain at the bottom. Like, oh, that's
but if you open that box and like endless fireworks explode in your face, is exactly what that was.
It's like the episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia when he's got hornets in a box. That's what it's like.
Yeah.
Oh my God! Yay!
When they open the hornets in the box. Just as a side note, I was singing to Bethany earlier Charlie's version of "Go Fuck Yourself."
I love it. It's one of the greatest. I loved it. I think it's one of the most amazing songs.
I was singing it to her earlier, so she's not appreciative. I'm sorry to break this up, but I want to make it entertaining for a second so that people will maybe stop and listen to all of this so that they can understand what goes on their television when they hear about the Middle East. This conference is where it begins.
That is absolutely correct. So, what was the thing? All of the Palestinian mandate is promised.
Welcome to our world. Wait, what are we talking about again?
Who am I? All of Palestine's promise, at least originally Chaim Weizmann, right, who's sort of representing the kind of Zionist group, thought that they were going to get all of Palestine. Churchill says, no, you're going to get everything west of the Jordan River and everything east of the Jordan River. I'm making that a new country, and it's going to be called Transjordan. And I'm going to put Abdullah there.
Paula Abdul? No, sorry.
No, yes, Paula Abdul, because her Opposites Attract is one of the greatest songs.
Yes! Straight up, now tell me, do you really want to love me forever?
Now I'm just imagining King Abdullah singing that. It's just not working.
Oh my God, that's amazing, actually. That is the exact mental picture I had, Warren. Is King Abdullah. That's amazing. Okay, Bethany, we do have to shut up and let's get through the Cairo conference because this is going to be very, very important to what we're going to talk about.
I'm enjoying myself. I'm sorry. I just cracked another beer. So
we got nothing but time, so let's enjoy ourselves. But this is important to let Warren get all the way through because this is going to be kind of everything going forward.
So let me stop here and tell you what's been going on in the Middle East before. So I've told you about the different people that Churchill's been has promised this. Not the Churchill, but the British government promised this land to. Well, in the meantime, before 1919, there are some other serious things have occurred. So during the First World War, T.E. Lawrence was able to get King Hussein, who is the sheriff of Mecca, to agree to rise against the Ottoman Empire. The sheriff of Mecca has 3 sons. One of them will be the sort of future sheriff of Mecca, right? So he'll be in Mecca. The other one is called Faisal, and the other one is called Abdullah. So Faisal is who T.E. Lawrence think is just the most amazing ruler, a real sort of warrior poet. And he and T.E. Lawrence, they eventually march into Damascus and take Damascus, and they're holding on to what they call the Free Kingdom of Syria. And they leave and they go to the table in 1919. Abdullah's got nothing yet, and when they get to the peace accords in 1919. Basically, Lloyd George and the other Western governments, the British government, the other Western governments are like, you're not getting anything. Sorry. We promised this land to France. Sucks to see you. Thanks for your help. We'll get back with you. Don't call us. We'll call you. That kind of thing.
West Francia, best Francia.
Exactly. And so people are feeling a little bit upset about how things are working. So Churchill, he's sitting around and he's been given this and he's got to figure out how to square the circle. Now, we've already said what's going on with Palestine and how he's going to do that. But he's got to figure out what to do with Faisal and what to do with Abdullah. So he comes up with what he calls the Sharifian solution. And this is the idea that he's going to transplant Faisal and make him the king of Iraq. And he's going to take Abdullah and make him the king of Jordan. Now, this doesn't work. In Churchill's mind, it does work because, if you've got a problem with one of the people, say Abdullah's not acting the right way, you can lean on Faisal and Faisal will get Abdullah to do it right. Or you can lean on the King Hussein and get him to get his sons in line. So this is, it sort of makes sense. But there are some other more serious problems with this prescription that Churchill doesn't anticipate. So one is, they transplant Faisal, who is king of Damascus and wants nothing to do with Iraq, to the Iraqi throne. Also, he's a Sunni and he's just been placed in a majority Shia country. That's going to work out. And you put Abdullah in Transjordan. Now, this is where things get a little wacky. They have to make it look like Faisal's invited to become king of Iraq. So they set up all these sort of fake elections. There's all these operations that go on. and basically, Faisal, having never been there, is invited to become king of Baghdad.
God, this sounds like Michael Romanoff.
Nah, kind of.
I mean, it's just like kind of the same concept where it's like, you know what? We're going to just make him czar. And he's like, wait, I'm going to be czar? I don't want to be czar. I haven't even been there in forever. I don't want to be this. Why pick me?
Well, this is it. I mean, he all he ever wanted to be was king of Damascus.
Yeah.
Well, Damascus
king of something else.
Yeah, he got king for that. So then Abdullah, so Churchill's going around at the Cairo conference, making sure everybody's cool with what's happened. And he's talking, he and T. Lawrence go see Abdullah, and Abdullah's happy to be king of anywhere, really. And one of the great historical ironies here is that T. Lawrence always thought Faisal was the great leader, when in fact Abdullah holds on, his direct line is still on the throne in Jordan, even to this day. Whereas Faisal, eventually there's a revolution and he's killed and things get out of hand. Because Iraq, while you have elements of the Sharifian solution that work, like Jordan, you have other elements of it, Palestine, Israel, Iraq, that are just complete train wrecks.
Right. Right. No, absolutely. And I agree. And so still are.
And one of the reasons they still are, and if you look literally at a map today of the Middle East, you can look at the line that was the Sykes-Picot Agreement that sort of delineates the northern part of Iraq. And then you can look at Jordan. And Winston Churchill literally drew that line on a map and was like, this is Jordan now. Done. And still living with those consequences. And like I say, in some areas it was successful. In other areas it wasn't. And he did do, to Churchill's credit here, he, at least he tried.
That's what I'm going to say. And that's where it's not like, and that's what I find interesting about this as well. We want to blame these things on Churchill, but he was really handed a shit sandwich and told, fix it. And it was
with
much out of his
mayonnaise
control. And he took as much advice because, again, this is a peace summit cover. Like, we don't have infinite amount of time to poll everybody about how they feel.
No, that's right. And also, they don't have an infinite amount of money. This is the end of the first. Exactly. There's no, so they're having to do all this stuff on the cheap.
And we're trying to get through the shit show that is the Treaty of Versailles. Like, there is just so much going on in the world stage, and they hand this poor man this shit sandwich. And I feel like
good luck. Have fun.
But I feel like he gets a really bad rap, and he at least took advice. I'm not going to say he took all the advice he could, but you're exactly right. There was infinite time. There wasn't infinite time. There wasn't infinite money. He did the best he could. It could have been a lot worse.
Absolutely. One of the interesting mix. So at the Cairo conference itself, you've got people advising there, like you say, Gertrude Bell's there, T.E. Lawrence. There's a famous picture of them all riding out on camels by the Sphinx. Yeah. It's a sort of famous picture. And there's a real interesting thing that happens because at the Cairo conference, they all unanimously agree that there needs to be a Kurdistan. A home for the Kurds, which is essentially the northern part of Iraq and parts of Turkey. Now, in many ways, this is all wrapped up into why Churchill loses power in 1922, the Chenet crisis. So what's happening in Turkey is they're not happy. They're being occupied by Greece and France, everybody else. The Ottoman Empire has collapsed. And then Mustafa Kemal, who becomes Ataturk, is basically, as a Turkish nationalist, like, fuck this. We're doing our own thing. We don't need the West. They start getting agitated and start marching and so forth. And so there's several letters that go back and forth between Churchill and the governor of Iraq, whose name miraculously has escaped me. And, where he's like, I really want there to be a Kurdistan. And he's like, look, if you try to realize Kurdistan, you're going to go to war with Turkey again. Do you want to do that?
Right.
And so, because they're trying to placate the Turkish nationalists, they basically all kind of decide Kurdistan can't happen. It might in the future, but right now, as we're settling things, it just can't happen because if you remove that sort of top Kurdish layer of Iraq, then you really have a sort of Shia Sunni country that's barely held together at all. You kind of need the third pillar to hold Iraq up as a state.
Right.
And so they decide, if you cut that down to two, you've got a house against itself. It won't stand.
It's going to teeter-totter over.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, bam.
So they abandoned Kurdistan as a concept in this. And I mean, Churchill he actually writes to Blunt saying, hey, look, I've done the best that I could. Blunt says, yeah, you did a pretty good job, but there's no chance in the world this is going to work, which is pretty interesting.
Good job, but not going to happen.
We're going to give you a C for effort,
Hey, I take C's. That's what I got.
We're going to hand you this giant shit sandwich, tell you to fix it, and then see. Exactly.
And we're going to complain about it for 100 years when it doesn't go right.
And then ultimately, U.S. citizens are going to somehow think that this is their fault. Now, we've made a lot of mistakes, but we didn't draw the map, guys. We really didn't. Exactly. It's become our problem, but we didn't draw the map.
It just sounds like the shit sandwich has been passed on to person to person to person. And more shit just keeps putting on.
That's exactly what's happened. The shit gets piled higher and deeper.
It's a big old BLT club sandwich. Like, it just keeps growing.
Different layers of shit.
Yum.
So they abandoned Kurdistan, and what happens is the Turkish nationalists, of course, decide they're going to go into Europe, and they're going to cross at Chanak. And Churchill says, he and Lloyd George are like, well, if this happens, we are going to go to war with Turkey. So they sent out a message saying, we're prepared, if Mustafa Kemal doesn't back down, we're prepared to go to war over this. And we're prepared to bring all the forces of the British Empire. Well, the next day, Australia and Canada send letters back to Britain, and they're like, we did not agree to go to war for any of this shit. I don't think so, pal. And
we didn't sign up for this. Excuse you.
That's exactly it. This is really
Isn't Commonwealthism a bitch? Like, at the end of the day.
Yeah. It's like, at the end of the day, we don't really take orders from you, right? You get that, right?
You're not my boss, okay?
Independence is a bitch.
Yeah.
You don't own me, okay?
Exactly.
You don't go here.
That's exactly what Australia and Canada, in fact, they have a press conference that says that. Churchill and Lloyd George can say what they want. We're not doing that. They can go fuck themselves, and we're not going to war anymore because it turns out war sucks.
Thanks, but no thanks.
Thanks, we can barely recover from the one we just limped through, guys. Like,
and this ultimately brings down the Lloyd George coalition in 1922. And as a result, it's so catastrophic, Lloyd George never holds an elective office again, ever. It shuts him down. And Churchill loses his office and is out of politics for 2 to 3 years, but then is able to re-rat back in.
Because he's an OG badass. That's why.
Exactly. That's exactly why. The final point is before he resigns, and this is hugely important moving forward, is that he has to deal with the fallout from this Israel-Palestine stuff.
Mm.
So you've got the Israeli delegation, or the sort of Zionist delegation, as they were called then, coming to him being like, hey, you said we're going to get all of Palestine. What the hell, man? And then you've got the Palestinians coming to him being like, hey, you just put a bunch of Jews in our backyard. Like, what's happening? And there's another argument that's happening on top of this. So Lloyd George, Balfour, Churchill, and Chaim Weizmann meet, and they have a meeting, and they say, when we say Jewish homeland, you understand we mean a Jewish state, right? And Churchill said, no, that's not what I promised Palestinians. I said they could have a national home, but it's not the same thing as a separate state. And Lloyd George and Balfour are like, no, it's a state. And Churchill gets so mad he gets up and walks out. Because
fuck this.
Did he really? I didn't know that.
Not a lot of people.
Walk the hell out at that.
Fuck you, I'm out.
Because for Churchill, right, who remember he's a hardcore imperialist. The British Empire, the force of civilization, can't lie to people. It has to be true to its word. And he sees this as a huge betrayal. And I mean, he's probably really exactly. So he got very upset at that. But he comes up with a thing in the white paper, and this is the final point that I want to make.
Yeah.
Which is about Jewish immigration into Palestine. even as a national home, not as a separate state, that it could take as many immigrants as they wanted up to the economic absorptive capacity. This is the phrase it uses.
Oh.
This creates a serious issue, as you'll see in the next episode when we go to the Inter-Warriors, because he never defined what that meant.
Yeah, I was gonna just say, what the hell does that even mean?
It doesn't mean anything.
It doesn't mean anything.
How do you know your economical maxing out? How do you even know that?
You don't.
You don't.
You don't even have a GDP yet, so you don't.
Okay.
So he's going around, and I mean, legitimately believing that you're going to have sort of Jewish people and Palestinian people working together, and everything was going to be great. He genuinely
even I can laugh at that.
Those days, right? And all of his experts are saying this is going to be great. Faisal, Abdullah, all of them say, yeah, bring the Jews, because they want the wealth that they'll bring.
Correct.
So Churchill thinks it's going to be great. Bring as many of them as you can. And then this plants the seed stuff, and the interwar era is going to get wildly out of control and ultimately lead to the problems we've got today with Israel and Palestine.
Right. But really quickly, can we just add, for Bethany's benefit and for viewers' benefit, is
thanks.
I mean that you have a massively displaced Jewish population. Let's even look at the Western, Central, Eastern, West, this massive Jewish population that is displaced, but a lot of them did have massive wealth, Bethany.
It's they have relative wealth compared to the sort of Palestinian peasants who'd been living under Ottoman rule.
Exactly.
And so anything that anyone can bring into Palestine will help. Now, Churchill's going around telling, in the House of Parliament, this is a great thing. They're resurrecting the ancient kingdom of Babylon and letting it have all of its glories, and all this kind of stuff. Tapping into that romantic sort of way to see the world.
And what a period for it, too. What a perfect, of course.
But in all of those actions, I mean, we haven't even talked about colonial air policing or any of the other stuff we can get into later. But seeds are planted.
We're going to have to.
Yeah, I think so. Seeds are planted that will grow up into trees today that are fucking us.
Over and over again in the anus as hard as possible. But I do just want to remind the world quickly, this was not a mess of our making for Americans.
No.
We've done some things, but this was not a mess of our making. And I would even argue it's not necessarily a mess of Churchill's making. It was desperation born out of war, and a lot of treaties were made, and it was a desperate time, and it's just a desperate attempt to reconcile a lot of things. And I would even argue that if Churchill was not as sympathetic to the Islamic world as he was, it could have been a lot worse.
I definitely agree with that. He did I can say he did the best he could with what he had to work with.
I agree. It's like that episode of South Park where they're talking about, like a douchebag or a shit sandwich. What are you going to do?
Exactly.
What are you going to do?
Who are you going to vote for?
Exactly.
Voldemort or.
But I think he did the best that he could do with what he did. And maybe, and I know that we're not trying to romanticize Churchill. That's certainly not what we're trying to do.
But it's like getting a better understanding of who he is as a person.
I think that if he hadn't have had the sympathy that he did, and I'm not saying that he's some, great savior, but if he had at least had an understanding and a sympathy that he did, it could have ended up much worse. And that's what I find so fascinating.
I agree.
Because this whole thing could have gone a completely different way.
It absolutely
in history.
Yeah. It could have gone really bad. you have to consider that it's I understand that things get out of control and stuff in the sort of interwar years, and then of course during the war. But for the most part, it wasn't pure chaos. You know what I mean? It wasn't as bad as it could have been.
No. And I will also say quickly, we're not here to argue imperialism and we're not here to argue empire. It was the way it was. So what we're looking at is in the definition of things were the way they were. They were not going to change. They were not going to be different. It was a very different time. I want our viewers to understand. So given what you were given to work with and nothing understand was going to change that, we did the best he could. And it's kind of remarkable, even given everything, because of the time period that we're talking about, that there was even at least this much of an attempt at understanding. It's kind of remarkable.
I feel like he scraped off a little bit of the shit. Like, hey, let me get rid of some of the shit. But then, of course, it comes back. So.
Well, it goes back to what Warren said about the imperialist promise. Like, you had to keep your promise, and I think that's so interesting that he just walked out of that meeting. I did not know that.
Yeah, he did. It's in the Felix Frankfurter papers because he was at the meeting and he recorded that Churchill left that meeting. It's in my book. I've forgotten the date, but I mean, I think that's a real good point. That everything we've said, and again, I don't want to romanticize them, and I certainly don't want to. I completely agree with you. I'm not making a case for the British Empire. It was an awful thing, but at the same time, things were how they were.
It was what it was. That's the point I think that we're all trying to make, and at least there was an attempt.
And T.E. Lawrence says in the Seven Pillars of Wisdom that Churchill, in his opinion, sort of did his best that he could to square the circle. And I think that's right.
No, I absolutely agree with that. And the reason I kind of want to, we'll close out today on that, and we'll come back from part 2 where we kind of keep looking at this lens, because I'm sorry, I just meant to interview you a little bit about your book, but I've gotten way too fascinated.
Well, good.
and weirdly enough, so have I. So I'm like, wait, tell me more. Tell me more.
That's because I'm deeply fascinating.
Yes.
Well, you kind of are, Doctor. But to me, and I didn't realize until I read your book, and this is why I want to take it longer, and this is what I want our listeners to understand very much. I didn't realize in my own education, in my own reading, how big of a gap there was in academic and popular opinion when it comes to Churchill and Islam. Does that make sense?
Yeah. To me.
In that both sides tend to kind of hijack, especially the far right in U.S., Britain, and I would even say the Muslim world. They kind of, I shouldn't probably use the word hijack in this context, but I'm going to. I apologize. They hijack the narrative of Churchill and his relationship with Islam. And it goes back to what we talked about in the very beginning of this podcast, especially in the Iraq War. And I do believe that it is a misconception. And I don't believe that I'm pulling that invisible rabbit out of a hat. And that's why I love your book so much, and why I thought it was so fascinating, and why I really want to deep dive it, is to just prove that there's a very, very big gap of disinformation that severely I did not know that there was, and until I read your book, and then I kind of got angry, if that makes sense.
You didn't know everything.
I like to get people angry with my books. That's my primary objective.
Well, not angry at you, but I mean angry in my own gap of knowledge, and angry that I've let myself be so influenced by common perception. It goes back to what we talked about in the very beginning of this, because that River War quote is ultimately seems to be this continuing defining legacy. And I think your book and I think this interview very much shows that is not the case, not at all.
No,
and
absolutely.
That's very much taken out of context.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you.
Which is just absolutely fascinating. So what we're going to do is we're going to call this part 1. And God, Warren, I apologize so much. I meant to wrap this up very quickly. This is what happens on our podcast when you come on
good.
it, though, Warren.
I love this. This was a lot of fun.
So, guys, this interview actually went a lot longer than what I attended. And our very gracious guest has agreed to come back for a part 2 because, as usual, Bethany and I have asked too many questions, got in too deep. And this is why we get into sweeping multi-part series about history. And of course, we would do the same thing that when we have a guest that's gracious enough to speak to us about topics. So we will be back with part 2 of this interview. It's very, very important. We're really, really excited for you guys to get this opportunity. And we thank you. And we will speak to you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.